I think about how many people get to the edge of making wrong mistakes in their life, and if they just stop and think, okay, God, what would you have me to do? He never gives wrong instructions. God has never failed to keep a promise He's made me.
Charles Stanley was born on September 25, 1932, in the tiny, hard-scrabble town of Dry Fork, Virginia, right in the cruelest depths of the Great Depression. It was a time when bread lines stretched around the block, fathers left in search of work and never returned, and families huddled around radios praying for a scrap of good news. Jobs were gone. Banks were collapsing. Hope was a rare and precious thing. For baby Charles, even that would be in short supply. Before his first birthday, his father, Charlie Stanley, died suddenly at just 29 years old. No sickness, no warning, no memories left behind, just a grave and a grieving widow holding a baby boy. That loss would become the defining wound of Charles Stanley's life. He would often speak in later years of the gaping emptiness he carried, the ache of never knowing his father's face, voice, or laugh, wondering who he might have become if that man had been there to guide him. Sense of abandonment, of vanishing fatherhood, followed him like a shadow. His mother, Rebecca, did what she could. Alone, in a world built for families of two, she scraped by. She scrubbed floors and took in sewing, doing anything to put food on the table. But heartbreak struck again when, at age 9, she remarried, hoping to give her son the father figure he'd lost. Instead, she gave him a monster. John Hall was a violent alcoholic whose rages terrorized their small household. Charles learned to sleep with his door locked, a loaded gun nearby, never sure what the night would bring. That trauma didn't just leave scars. It forged the preacher he would become. It taught him the cruel unpredictability of men and the unshakable constancy of God. Amid the shouting, slamming doors, and nights when his home felt more like a battlefield than a refuge, young Charles Stanley found peace in the only place that never raised its voice against him: the church. His spiritual roots ran deep in Pentecostal soil. His grandfather was a founding member of the Emmanuel Pentecostal Holiness Church, a modest country church where sermons came as shouts, prayers came as wails, and people didn't just talk to God. They pleaded, wept, and shouted His name. For a boy living with fear in his bones, those fiery services felt like a sanctuary. The walls rattled with hymns, air thick with the scent of old wood, sweat, and fervent faith. On nights when home felt unbearable, Charles would quietly slip away and hide in the church basement. There, amid musty hymnals and creaky pews, he'd cry out to God, not in silence, but in raw, desperate sobs. He wasn't reciting memorized prayers. He was pleading for peace, for safety, for someone to hear him when no one else did. Raw, emotional connection to faith never left him. Even after he became a Southern Baptist, known for a more reserved, orderly style, that Pentecostal fire clung to his preaching. You could hear it in his voice, see it in his eyes. He didn't just preach scriptures, bled them. And then, at 17 years old, came the conversation that would chart his life's course. Visiting his grandfather in Siler City, North Carolina, Charles confessed he didn't feel worthy of ministry. Too young, too broken, but his grandfather, a man seasoned by hardship, smiled and gave him the single piece of advice that would become Charles Stanley's life motto: if God tells you to run your head through a brick wall, you run. It's His job to make the hole. And from that moment, Charles Stanley would obey, no matter the cost. By the time Charles Stanley was 26, he had accomplished what few of his peers had even dared to dream. He was a fully ordained Baptist minister. In an era when most pastors weren't ordained until well into their 30s, Charles stood behind the pulpit early, armed with fire in his voice and scars in his past. His timing was impeccable. America in the 1950s and 60s was a nation on edge. The Cold War was escalating, and the Cuban Missile Crisis brought the world within inches of nuclear catastrophe. Racial tensions simmered, political assassinations shook the nation, and churches struggled to stay relevant in a society bracing for radical change. Through it all, Charles Stanley preached. He took on churches in Ohio, Florida, and Georgia, often stepping into small, struggling congregations and transforming them. He connected not with polished sermons, but with raw, authentic messages about hurt, survival, and redemption, speaking directly to the broken-hearted farmers, factory workers, and single mothers in his pews, people who, like young Charles, knew what it meant to be afraid, abandoned, and uncertain. Then, in 1969, Stanley received a call that would alter the course of his life. He was asked to serve as associate pastor at First Baptist Church of Atlanta. What he didn't know was that he was walking into a powder keg. The church was a mess, torn apart by theological disputes, generational clashes, and political infighting. Sermons turned into shouting matches. Deacons fought over doctrine. Tensions ran so high that at one infamous church meeting, a man actually punched Charles Stanley in the face, in the middle of the sanctuary. Most would have walked away. Charles stayed. For 2 brutal years, he endured whispered plots, open opposition, and relentless criticism. He kept preaching, kept counseling, kept visiting the sick, and burying the dead. Slowly, he won the trust of those willing to believe the church could be saved. Then came October 1st, 1971, the vote. That night, the sanctuary was tense. The vote wasn't about hiring a pastor, it was about choosing a side. And when the ballots were counted, Charles Stanley was declared the new senior pastor of First Baptist Atlanta. Many who opposed him stormed out. Others followed in the weeks to come. But what remained was a bruised, battered, but united church, finally ready to rebuild. And under Stanley's leadership, it wouldn't just rebuild, it would become a global phenomenon. In 1972, long before megachurches became household names and televangelists filled late-night airwaves, Charles Stanley quietly launched a modest local TV program in Atlanta called The Chapel Hour. There were no flashy graphics, no celebrity guests, no stadium-sized congregations, just a simple 30-minute Bible study filmed inside his church, aimed at reaching hearts in the Atlanta area. To his surprise, it quickly drew 16,000 loyal viewers, a staggering number for a regional religious broadcast at the time. But everything changed in 1978. That year, the upstart Christian Broadcasting Network, CBN, then in its infancy but hungry for compelling Christian programming, reached out to Charles Stanley with an offer, a national platform. While some pastors might have hesitated, concerned about watering down sermons or chasing ratings, Stanley immediately said yes. Not because he sought fame, but because he saw television as the ultimate tool for spreading the gospel. Within a single week of airing nationally, his audience ballooned from 16,000 to millions. The program was rebranded In Touch with Dr. Charles Stanley, a name that would soon become synonymous with powerful, uncompromising Bible preaching around the world. By the early 1980s, Stanley wasn't just a pastor anymore. He was a media force. His sermons appeared on every major television market in the United States and rapidly expanded into over 114 languages across 150 nations. But he didn't stop at television. Always a forward thinker, Charles pioneered solar-powered audio Bibles for remote villages without electricity. He invested in radio, satellite, and digital media long before other ministries caught on. His obsession with using every available technology to fulfill the Great Commission made In Touch Ministries one of the most effective, far-reaching evangelical organizations on the planet. At its peak, his sermons aired on over 4,000 broadcast outlets in 127 languages, reaching audiences as far as Antarctica. But while Charles Stanley was reaching the ends of the earth, his own family back home was quietly crumbling. The cameras never caught the tension. The broadcasts never hinted at the fractures. But behind the glow of studio lights and satellite towers was a marriage unraveling, and a home growing increasingly distant. The man who could hold a global audience in the palm of his hand struggled to hold his family together. On the surface, Charles Stanley was untouchable. To his congregation, he was the embodiment of faith, family, and Christian leadership. The man who stood in the pulpit every Sunday and preached about marriage, commitment, and the sacred vows of family. To the world, he was a steady, moral compass in an increasingly chaotic culture. But behind closed doors, a very different story was playing out. His wife, Anna Stanley, had spent decades in the shadows of sermons, church politics, and a ministry that devoured every spare moment of Charles's attention. What began as a supportive partnership slowly became a lonely existence. She watched as his sermons reached millions, while conversations at home dwindled to nothing. She sat in the same pews where he preached about cherishing one's spouse, knowing that when he stepped off that platform, she'd once again be invisible. He chose his priorities, Anna would later admit, and I wasn't one of them. In 1993, after years of emotional distance and growing resentment, Anna quietly filed for divorce. She signed the paperwork as A.J. Stanley, but in the tight-knit evangelical world, anonymity was impossible. When news of the divorce leaked, it sent shockwaves through Christian media. The backlash was swift and merciless. Christian TV stations pulled his sermons from the air. Fellow pastors called for his immediate resignation. Religious publications questioned his leadership. Even Charles himself had once boldly declared, "If I ever get divorced, I'll step down from the ministry." But when that moment came, he didn't. Anna withdrew the divorce petition briefly, perhaps hoping for reconciliation. But when it became clear that the distance between them was too great to bridge, she refiled. What followed was 7 long, emotionally charged years of legal and personal limbo. The marriage officially ended in May 2000. Charles Stanley, once the gold standard of evangelical family values, was now a divorced man. His sermons still broadcast in over 50 languages, but his home empty. And the damage reached beyond just a marriage. Because this wasn't only about a pastor losing his wife, it was about a father losing his family, a husband losing his lifelong partner, and a leader facing the one storm his pulpit couldn't shield him from, his own private heartbreak. For years, it had been assumed that Andy Stanley would one day step into his father's shoes. From the outside, it seemed inevitable. He was bright, charismatic, a gifted speaker, and Charles Stanley's only son. Congregation members whispered about the day Andy would inherit the pulpit of First Baptist Church of Atlanta, keeping the Stanley dynasty alive for another generation. But Andy had other plans. In 1995, at the height of his father's public struggles, Andy made a decision that shook both their family and the evangelical world. He announced he was leaving First Baptist Atlanta, not to take over another established church, but to start his own. North Point Community Church was born out of a quiet rebellion. Andy's philosophy was radically different from his father's. While Charles preached bold, uncompromising sermons rooted in tradition, Andy envisioned a church designed for people who didn't like church. "Atlanta doesn't need another church," he famously said. "It needs a safe place for people who don't go to church." What began as a modest gathering of a few hundred exploded into something no one expected. Within 1 year, over 4,000 people filled North Point's seats every Sunday, and it kept growing. Over time, it expanded into multiple campuses, eventually drawing more than 43,000 people weekly, making it one of the largest and most influential churches in America. And during those years of growth, father and son barely spoke. The silence between them became a public secret in evangelical circles. 2 men who preached forgiveness every Sunday, yet couldn't offer it to each other. Christian media churned out theories. Was it pride? Jealousy? The divorce fallout? Theological differences? Personality clashes? No one knew the truth because neither of them spoke about it. It wasn't until years later that healing began. They quietly started therapy together, held raw, difficult conversations. Both men had spent years hiding behind pulpits and audiences. Now, they were forced to face each other, not as pastor and successor, but as father and son. At one pivotal lunch, Charles looked across the table and said words Andy had waited a lifetime to hear. "I don't want us to end up like all those other fathers and sons." Andy, choking back emotion, simply replied, "Me neither, Dad." In that moment, the ice began to thaw, and something in both of them changed. By 2013, something remarkable had happened. Andy Stanley's North Point Ministries wasn't just successful. It had become the second largest church in the United States. The son who once walked away from his father's shadow had built a ministry of his own, with a completely different style, philosophy, and following. Where Charles preached behind a grand wooden pulpit, Andy spoke casually on a stage. Where Charles delivered verse-by-verse expository sermons, Andy focused on conversational, practical messages for people far from faith. For years, those differences had driven a wedge between them. But then, one Sunday morning, in front of thousands gathered at First Baptist Atlanta, the unthinkable happened. The same Charles Stanley, who once made veiled criticisms about modern church styles and hinted at disappointment in his son's choices, stood behind his pulpit and praised Andy. Publicly, proudly. It was brief, simple, but it mattered. Privately, Charles gave his blessing, and Andy never forgot it. In the final chapter of Charles Stanley's life, the relationship between father and son finally began to heal in earnest. As Charles's health declined and his strong frame grew frail, Andy made regular visits to his father's home. The towering preacher who once commanded global audiences now spent his days in a well-worn leather recliner, too weak to move much, but still sharp, still aware. And every time Andy visited, before he left, Charles would grab his hand and quietly say, "Pray for me." That became their sacred ritual, a rhythm that spoke louder than sermons, a bridge between what had been broken and what was finally mending. That old recliner, in those final years, became more than a chair. It became a seat of reconciliation, a place where decades of distance, silence, and stubborn pride melted away, replaced by simple, honest conversations between a father and a son. It hadn't always been this way. There were years when their dinners were filled with long, punishing silences. Divorce had devastated not just a marriage, but the father-son bond that should have been unbreakable. But slowly, and without fanfare, they found their way back. Then came April 15th, 2023. Just 3 days before Charles Stanley passed away, Andy made his usual visit, and as he stood to leave, Charles did something he had never done before. He said, "I pray for you." Room fell silent, prayed, slowly, haltingly. And when he finished, he looked at his son and said the 7 words that carried the weight of a lifetime. "I couldn't be prouder of you, Andy." Those would be the last words Charles Stanley ever spoke to his son. On April 18th, 2023, at 7:30 a.m., Charles Stanley passed away. He was 90 years old. He had preached for 66 years, led First Baptist Atlanta for 50, translated into 114 languages, broadcast in 150 nations. He was one of the most influential Christian voices in history. And yet, he preached about forgiveness, but had to learn how to offer it. He taught about marriage, but lost his own. Led millions, but had to fight to reconnect with 2. His daughter, Becky, witnessed it all. The glory, grief. She stayed close. She stayed silent. But in the end, she was there with Andy as her father's story came to a close. Charles Stanley left behind an empire, but more importantly, he left behind a repaired family. He couldn't save his marriage, but he saved his relationship with his son. Not with sermons, not with cameras, but with quiet moments in a chair and 7 final words. Maybe that's the real legacy of Charles Stanley. Not just the sermons or the satellites, but the grace to say, at the end, "I couldn't be prouder of you." Because in the end, every preacher becomes a man. Every sermon fades. What's left is the family. If this story moved you, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share it with someone who needs to hear it. What part of Charles Stanley's life impacted you the most? Tell us in the comments.